Good morning, everyone.
Can
Can you hear me here? Okay, thanks. Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime celebrates learning beyond the classroom with Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It's a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. If you enjoy Primetime programming, please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Library. More information is available on the library website, where you can also find archived recordings of most Primetime presentations in the BU Digital Library. Join us on Tuesday, March 6th at 11:15, when an interdepartmental team of Andy Johnson, Tandon Brecky, Nicholas Swedlund share about their collaboration with Teresa Forliti of Breaking Free to develop a series of educational videos that will be used to raise awareness of human trafficking in Minnesota. Today we welcome Dr. Ruth Nelson and Dr. Andy Johnson as they celebrate the publication of the book they co-edited with Dr. Emily Lunt, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University. It's entitled Religion, Disability, and Interpersonal Violence. Ruth Nelson directs the Academic and Enrichment Support Center and teaches in the undergrad program in developmental psychology and disability studies. She's a nationally certified school psychologist whose research interests are in the areas of developmental psychology, psychoeducational, psychosocial, and community interventions for individuals with disabilities across the lifespan, and faith integration with disability studies. Andy Johnson teaches in the undergrad programs in psychology and religious studies. His research interests are in the areas of gender violence prevention, religious predictors of domestic violence and rape myth acceptance, and trauma and resiliency. Andy actively serves on state and national boards and committees, including the Board for the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence, Division 36, Society for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality of the American of APA, and the Olmsted Specialty Committee for the State of Minnesota, which oversees the implementation of the State Abuse and Neglect Prevention Plan. Please welcome Ruth and Andy.
Thank you, Jen. Can you hear me okay?
Nope, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet? Do I need to turn it up?
Or on, or?
Should be on.
It's on. So maybe I'll move it up. Is that a little better?
Yeah, better.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming to our presentation. I want to say a little bit about how the book came about as a way of introduction. When I first started work on the first book in the series, Religion and Violence Against Women, discovered that there are varying estimates, but one of the most conservative estimates of the prevalence of violence against women in the United States is there are about 88 instances on average per hour in the United States, and these are just the ones reported to law enforcement. Now, nobody in the movement to end gender violence believes the numbers are actually that low. Our most accurate estimates based on surveys, if you ask women, has this happened to you, and you describe behaviors that meet the criteria for the intimate partner violence or sexual assault and rape, that's probably somewhere between 10 and 15 times that rate. If you ask men about what they've done in relationships, it's about 5 to 6 times. So regardless of what the actual numbers or rates are, they're very high. It looks like, as best we can tell from the research that is available, that people with disabilities face abuse at a much higher rate than is the case for people without disabilities. And when I was doing the first book, I had a chapter on violence against women in the deaf community, because deaf women are raped at astronomically high rates, well in excess of 85%, which is higher than almost any group, with a possible exception of American Indian women who are also raped at very high rates. But it turns out that because that chapter didn't really have enough information in it on religion, my editor Springer wanted it out of the book, and I protested. I said, if this sees print, this will be the only such article of its kind in the entire world in any language. It's too vital, it's too important a topic, it needs to see print. And she says, you're right. The people aren't going to look for it here. Let's take it out and we'll make this a book in its own right. And so we agreed to that. So when Religion and Men's Violence Against Women came out, we automatically had mandate from the publisher to go out and do a book on violence against women in the deaf community. Well, to get ready for that, I put together a symposium at APA. It still amazes me that our success rate of getting a symposium accepted at APA on violence against women with disabilities. And we put together a group of very diverse scholars. And before we even got to APA, we were contacted in Ruth by 2 different acquisition editors from publishers, and they wanted the symposium made into a book. And so that's essentially what happened. Ruth came with me with her expertise in disabilities. I know not so much about disabilities, but on religion and my partner violence and sexual assault, a little bit about human trafficking. And that's how it came about. The work in and of itself, creating no wrong doors, what we discovered in looking at things through the transformative justice paradigm is the assumption that essentially all of society needs to be changed and transformed in order to make the world safe for everyone, safe and free from violence. This is very much interwoven with the feminist tradition of scholarship in this area, which looks at crimes against women, very violent crimes, part of violence, sexual assault and rape. But it's also combined with the womanist tradition and looking at how women at diverse social locations face very different challenges sometimes. So for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff, I don't know if you noticed locally that 2 of the 2 men right in a row who were shot and killed by police, men of African ancestry. One was at an apartment building close to Regent's Hospital in St. Paul, and that was a call on a domestic violence incident. And the police came out and some things happened, but he was shot and killed. And then if you look after that, Jamar Clark case, again, was a call on a domestic, and he ends up dying as well. And so within communities of African ancestry, people are very sensitive to this. They notice this. And there are concerns then about calling in police and so on and so forth. So the system doesn't work equally well for everyone. And you see this also in the deaf community and so on and so forth. So the theoretical roots of a work such as ours are based on these things. It's also based on the assumption that it's not so, that the numbers are so high. It's better to look at equipping mental health professionals to work with religious communities and other segments of society and putting it into and preventing and then treating gender-related violence. And that's more important than getting the most precise, exact estimate. It's very difficult to do so for a variety of reasons, which could take an hour in itself. And so I'll go on for there. Now, in the communities of persons with disabilities, they oftentimes refer to interpersonal violence, and the reason for that is that sometimes caretakers are also involved in abuse and neglect cases and so on. And so they tend to prefer the term interpersonal violence to account for things like that. Why don't I? So Emily Lund and her colleague Thomas talk about disability-specific factors that impact abuse. So there are important differences. One is that there are barriers that people with disabilities face in terms of getting help and accessing resources. My favorite article, and this is by Marcia Saxton and her group out at UCal Berkeley, Bring me my scooter so I can leave you. I mean, you don't even have to read the entire title to see the challenge that someone might have if they're dependent upon a caregiver for help. Right. There are certain barriers, and this is even more so with people in the deaf community and people with blindness and so on. How do they get access to help? Interpersonal violence itself might be influenced by the presence of a disability. In the deaf community, sometimes an abuser will tell the abused, usually it's the woman, often not, who's abused by the man, that well, you're hearing, you're hearing minded, and that's considered a terrible insult. It's like you're not really one of us, and the insult can be related to the disability itself, or who could possibly love you because you need to use a wheelchair to get around, things like that that are related specifically to a disability. And some individuals may need assistance with money management, and they might be more liable to financial abuse. Disability-related factors can complicate and suppress the reporting of abuse and interpersonal violence. A classic example in the deaf community is when you have a hearing partner abusing a deaf partner, and the police come out, and they may not want to take time to get an interpreter, and then getting a RID certified, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf is what RID means. It can take time and things like that. They have a very pressing schedule, so sometimes they will actually rely on the abuser himself to get the report as to what's going on, or someone from his family or one of his friends who may be hearing. You can tell, I mean, that would really affect the reporting of abuse and how things are interpreted into the system. Some people are afraid that they might lose their independence due to reporting, or adult protective services. Sometimes the record can be spotty in terms of how well these things are handled. The thrust of the work then looks at how practitioners can provide support and accommodations throughout reporting and legal involvement. In the deaf community, it's not unusual for someone to go to court, and all these decisions as for a survivor will be made without her knowing they're supposed to provide an interpreter. Sometimes they do, and sometimes for whatever reason they may not do that. And so all these things can happen without her being aware or knowing or understanding what exactly is happening. And so that needs to be provided. So in general then, the work looks at how is it that mental health practitioners can become more aware, more competent to deal with not only interpersonal violence, but interpersonal violence in people with disabilities. The second part of it is how do we awaken the sleeping giant? You know what I mean by the sleeping giant? The church. The church could be a tremendous asset. But unfortunately, oftentimes people with disabilities are not welcome. Or there may be accessibility issues, or people may not be prepared to deal with them. The church does not have the best record when it comes to helping battered women or survivors of sexual assault. So there's a lot of potential here. But the first part of the book essentially looks at what is it that the church can do, and how can mental health practitioners work with church and religious communities to become more of an asset in the movement to end gender violence. And the second part looks more at the intersection of interpersonal violence, disability, and social location. Things like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on. Well, with that, Ruth Nelson, I was delighted when she accompanied me as a co-editor, and she wrote a pretty good chunk of the book. And writing about 4 chapters for us, so we're very proud of Ruth.
All right, you can hear me okay? Wonderful. All right. So I was blessed to work with Emily and Andy on this project, and I've had a passion for a long time in just understanding disability and understanding how we treat one another as a result of this differences among us. And I first, of course, want to acknowledge all the wonderful students that helped with this project. Lily Hoganson and Courtney Cahill did a lot of the interviews with me. And then Dr. Matron Wang from the Fayetteville State University, she had done some instrumental work back in 2009 looking at how do churches respond to IPV as far as their policies on divorce or their statements, and then how do they actually treat the individuals going through those situations. Dr. Emily Lind, as we've mentioned, our co-editor, she's at St. Cloud State now. And then I really have to highlight, there was a domestic violence agency right here in the Twin Cities, that one of the main advocates there, she herself is a Christian, and she really saw a need for her clients to bring in the faith piece and to do better collaboration with churches. And she also saw that I don't see a lot of those with physical disabilities, low incidence sensory disabilities, those who may have blindness or hearing loss. She wondered, why don't I have more of those individuals at the domestic violence shelters? So she really paved the way, helped to create safety for the interviewees, and making sure that non-identifying information got out anywhere, because we were actually, in a couple of situations, meeting in their homes, and some of that information was quite protected. A couple of the perpetrators had spent several years in prison in some of these situations. So you can imagine what kind of atrocities happened to those two individuals. All right, huge thanks to Bethel for the spring sabbatical in 2016, where I was able to do a lot of these interviews. I did work a couple of summers as well. And then the faculty development grants to give to clients who met and interviewed with us, as well as the pastors. Again, as I said, my parents have always been those who have looked for those on the margins and just modeled that in our lives. And I have adopted siblings who have disabilities, so of course that sparked my interest as well, to seek out justice. I always tell my students in my classes that disability is the open enrollment category. You can join at any time. Sometimes, but, maybe it's small or minor, but the reality is at any point in time it can happen. So in June we'll celebrate the 3rd anniversary of my brother being hit by a distracted driver, and he suffered a traumatic brain injury with many bleeds and went into a coma, 17 broken bones and a sheath in his arm and his head, and a neurosurgeon who flew in from Seattle to meet that need, and God preserved his life. And so he's got a lot of effects from it. Lost vision in one eye and lost part of his hearing. My own daughter last week was struggling with a knee flare-up, and they were like, okay, I think this is JRA, and so we're just, you never know what life is going to hand to you. We kind of live in these fragile bodies that somehow are resilient as well. So I was able to work on a couple of different studies, and I just wanted to point out what were kind of the foundational frameworks that kind of directed and centered our thinking. And the first one, we are concerned about restorative justice and perpetrators, but I should have written transformative justice, which is more working on the side of working with individuals and collaborators who are supporting their healing journeys. We're going to talk a little bit about models of disability, especially the social model versus medical models and others, and then Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. And some of this might be review for some of you students too, if you've taken disabilities course. So the models of disability are really important to kind of attend to, and that's because I went to a great keynote 2 weeks ago at the National Association of School Psychologists, and Dr. Robbins is a PhD communications scientist, Vietnamese immigrant like my brother, and he talked about how we carry around with us these mental models. We just soak it up naturally, okay? And that we don't, 70 to 80% of our day, we use that part of the brain that just makes automatic assumptions, quick judgments, and puts those mental models. He doesn't like the term stereotype. He's like, I don't like to use that. We put those into place, and so we don't rationally think it through and say, is this appropriate? Is this based on it, good empirical data, et cetera. And so I'd like us to just take a peek at these models and see if we're unconsciously ascribing to these. The medical model obviously is the most well-known, and there's definitely positive things that have come from the medical model and the functional model, technology, thank goodness for cortisone to relieve all of the inflammation in my daughter's knee right now. They've pulled over 300 cc's off of it, so wonderful. But on the other hand, what it also brings along with it is that it tends to see disability as negative, that the condition is the problem, that we have to fix them. They're not okay as is, right? And that they're passive receivers of these services, that they don't have any good information to contribute to working towards coping well. We also see the moral model, where disability, there's many manifestations of this, whether it's an affliction, a curse, a special gift from God, a blessing. That being disabled is negative, typically in these venues. Can be a result of the fall. It can be from sin committed by a family member. It could be a thorn in the flesh. These are all these kinds of things that are thrown out there as more of a moral model. And the remedy, of course, is healing or maybe deliverance, repentance, or acceptance. That's God's plan for this individual's life. And the agent of remedy is God and the individual's response to him. You have the functional model. The rehabilitative model. This focuses more like an economic model. What are the functional abilities of an individual, trying to work with that person to retain as much functional capacity to work in a job. And so it, again, though, is a very more negative look and just focuses on the limitations instead of the strengths that a disability may bring. Finally, the environmental model, the social model, maybe you're familiar with this. It sees disability as a difference, and it kind of turns the medical model on its head. Instead of the medical model points at the individual with the disability is the problem, this says, what is it about our environment that socially constructs and makes it actually, when I have a disability, the environment around me is making it more disabling for me, the way they treat me, the way they exclude me, lack of accessibility, whether in a church setting, whether in schools, attitudes or fear. Nancy Iceland has this one story she writes about where the woman wanted to participate in the church choir and she didn't have her hands, and the choir director said, no, I'm sorry, you can't participate because it'll be too distracting for the parishioners. And then I had a friend who had a sensory disability, and she was told she couldn't go on any mission trips because of this sensory disability. They thought it'd be too much work for them to try and adapt and make it accessible for her. And then we also see some of the poor job prospects based on negative media and negative messages coming from mass media. All right. So if we think about those models and we just really try to think about, do I unconsciously treat someone or think something about that person with an individual because of one of those models, and how can I turn that around and see the person as an individual, and then also realize, again, I was introduced to Uri Bronfenbrenner in graduate school, thanks to Dr. Sandy Christensen. She, in that time and zeitgeist of the school psych program, was really focusing on the ecological factors that affect individuals' development instead of blaming the child, right, or blaming the individual. I think we get into a lot of victim blaming with IPV survivors, and then even the perpetrators themselves blame the women because of the disability. Well, if you didn't have that disability, I wouldn't get that angry. One man even used the Bible verse completely out of context. You don't provoke me to anger, like the Bible verse says. He goes, it's your disability that is doing that. So you have the individual and you have these nested spheres of influence of these systems, the microsystem, that's those more direct daily kind of interactions. How does the church respond to the individual who's going through intimate partner violence? Do they victim blame? Well, you guys didn't get married, so I'm sure that's why this is happening. Immediate family, sometimes they are isolated from their family. School situations, work situations. A woman with IPV and a disability may feel doubly marginalized. She may be anxious about going to work. She may not physically be able to go to work. It might be really anxious to drive to work, knowing that her partner may be very jealous and monopolizing of her time. And so she's on a tight timeline of when she can go and come back home, who she's talked to, all of those jealous behaviors that some may romanticize as a good thing, but are very monopolizing and controlling. So what are these microsystems? What kind of direct influence do they have on that individual? What are the exosystems? When we studied some of the research, for example, the legal system, it was really disappointing to find that, like a rural study in North Dakota, most of the time the individuals, they didn't have to fully serve their jail time, nor did they have to fully pay their fines. And then actually, in 29 of 31 cases in which the perpetrator pled not guilty, were actually dismissed. And that was in 2012. And so we see increased risk of IPV in geographical settings like rural locations, and then even less access to disability accessible centers of care. And our neighborhoods can extend some situational influences too. The macro system is more of this broad cultural messages, mass media messages, things like what are the roles of men and women in society? How does our U.S. society see women? And you see how do they perceive disability? Most of it is quite negative, and just in general violence against women. Looking at the Killing Us Softly series, you see women dismembered and selling things, advertisements. You see them silenced, equated as animals, and that this is pretty common. Another interesting study in 2017 from Great Britain, they looked at the newspaper headlines for the past 10 years. And they looked at intimate partner violence, what were the messages. Most of them were negative, and they actually pointed towards spelling out messages of deserving or non-deserving women. So really almost affirming this type of behavior. So you can definitely see where some of these influences can impact the woman or the individual in IPV. We focus more on women. That happen to be my study participants, but it does occur in men, and there's a good chapter in their book devoted to that as well. These are just an overview of some of the studies that I did with students, and it was fun. We did a student survey, so we had 113 Bethel students give their perceptions of disability, what kind of models they might ascribe to, and then their religious beliefs, how common IBV was here in their college setting, and then among family and friends, and then what was the pastor's response to that. We also did these faith leader interviews with metro area pastors. We tended to go with larger churches, membership of 1,500 or more, because those who had disability ministries, trying to figure out, okay, how, if you've navigated this area a little bit, how are you responding to victims who have a disability? And then, thankfully, to the domestic violence advocate, I was able to do these interviews with these women. And it's really a sacred trust to be able to hear their stories. And the interviews are really trying to examine what's the accessibility of services by pastors, because these are all women of faith. And some of them came from some of our CCU sister schools. So these women that I interviewed. What is the response of pastors to them? The domestic violence advocates in that particular setting was their programmatic access, physical access, and attitudinal access. And again, our rationale for the project, I think, is really important to emphasize. Research continues to demonstrate that there's only some pastoral training in IPV. When I met with the pastors, very few had training. Now, I had very much an older sample for the most part. The mean of work experience was about 19, 20 years. But very little had pastoral training at IPV. Most of them had sought out more training because they're in this urban setting, and they see this quite frequently. It's just as common in the church as at large. And then none of them had disability cultural competency training at all. And that was something that was interesting, even though 3/4 of them had a family member who had a disability. And there is evidence, current evidence too, that they tend to deny, minimize, or ignore IPV and encourage victims to stay in an abusive relationship. So if women with disabilities are more likely to experience IPV, and women of faith are more likely to stay longer in unsafe relationships, then there's a real need and concern for education information by faith leaders as well as your domestic violence advocates and working through religious beliefs together to get to safety. Safety is always the main goal. Women with disabilities have shared that domestic violence advocates would be more welcoming if they didn't feel stigmatized because they were victims or judged for their disability. They also tend to perceive domestic violence shelters as less accessible than providers perceive. In larger scale studies, it's really interesting that those women with disabilities find them to be less accessible than the providers perceive. And I have an example of that where the provider who was working with a particular client, she had had a severe traumatic brain injury, and she said, could you please lower the lights in the group time, and can we not have background music because it makes it harder for me to process on the information, and can you emphasize the main points? And the group leader never, she asked her once or twice, never did take out, never supplied the accommodations for that. And then women with disabilities are reluctant to share with pastoral staff due to blaming treatment they have seen other survivors receive from the pastor. Or current research even show that some faith leaders just lack the courage to confront IPV and tell survivors they don't want to take sides. Some of the pastors in my sample had done specific training with a domestic violence agency and had gone so far to even do divorce kind of, like we'll work through and encourage a divorce or a separation because they know that usually these behaviors escalate, that it's very lethal. One of the mistakes pastors tended to make was that they would focus on the disability, the mental health issue or the depression issue, and see that as the primary issue instead of also looking at the lethality of IPV and addressing them at the same time. So yeah, maybe they need a mental health assessment, but they may also need transition housing right now too at the same time. So this was my colleague Wang. She found that Christian women congregations that did not support divorce in cases of IPV appeared to be more likely to be victims of abuse. All right, so again, as I said, where are the strengths and gaps between these collaborative relationships and the accessibility they provide to women? Here's just a sampling of the interview questions that we used. And here's our definition for disability, primarily using the Americans with Disabilities Act and the amendments, and then also the Healthy People 2010 objective questions. Are you limited in any way in daily activities because of physical, mental, or emotional problems? Do you have any new health problems that require you to use special equipment such as a cane, wheelchair, adapted bed, or telephone? We also provided accessible transportation. I think only one of my clients that I interviewed could use transportation. One was due to medication. Two of them were in poverty and didn't have transportation, so we provided Ubers or cabs to the domestic violence agency. And so that was a key concern, is just providing accessible transportation if they had a physical disability. One woman was half paralyzed. And so there's all kinds, she needed medical transportation and she had severe panic attacks so that she couldn't do public transportation. And so we had to really think about this when we were trying to work with these clients. And then also the accessibility format of the questions. I sent them ahead of time in a digital form so that they felt comfortable with it and would be able to feel comfortable saying, yes, I'd love to participate. And if it would raise too much anxiety, then they had that option not to participate, of course. Here's a sampling of the interview questions. Did your significant other have any religious beliefs that didn't support your safety and your healing process? I learned a lot about how they misused scripture, even a Muslim man misusing the Quran. And even the woman in the situation at first was like, I know this is not right. But that's where domestic violence advocates and faith professionals really need to be more aware of the misuse of scripture and other sacred texts. If you're a part of a faith community or have been in the past, would you or did you approach a faith leader? Can you share how helpful was that and what support would you also like to see? What has been most helpful to you experiencing IPV as a woman with a disability? Were there any gaps in services and collaboration, either with the domestic violence shelter or the faith community or the collaboration of these two institutions? And then what do you wish professionals knew about the dynamics of having a disability that would change interactions and support? So it was a very small sample. Obviously can't be generalized larger beyond this, but it's a great beginning study. A variety of disabilities were represented: mental health, physical, and health disabilities, but no sensory disabilities. They ranged in ages from early 20s to mid-50s. A little over half were Caucasian and 43% were African American. All reported having a faith background and were currently practicing their faith. 6 of them attended church services, and one of them couldn't because of the medical needs of her child, and so she used the Bible app to be able to just listen, stream services. This quote hit me hard when I interviewed this particular client, and this was one of the most severe cases that I saw. And this perpetrator did spend a significant amount of time, and she was moved out of state. It was that severe of a situation. It was me and God. Even when I didn't feel comfortable talking to church friends, even though he didn't say anything, God spoke the loudest through his Holy Spirit. I remember crying myself to sleep at night. I can't describe it. I felt like I was being rocked to sleep by God, put my kids to bed, and then cried on the couch, lonely and afraid of everyone. I don't really know what it feels like to be loved outside of my kids. He, God, would say, I love you, and he put people in my life that demonstrated real, loving relationships. She was one whom the pastor's wife just basically became a spiritual mentor to her, and when her husband went to prison, she lived with their family. Of these women, 3, they were asked, who would you want to go to first? 3 asked the domestic violence agency for support, 2 preferred the police, probably due to the severity of their injuries, and then the other 2 preferred the church to be a first responder. What actually happened, of the 7 women, 4 did not tell a faith leader about the IPV, and 3 did. Of reasons shared for not telling a faith leader, they were fearful again of them passing judgment and felt shame. I was impressed with the church faith leaders. This is the narratives of the victims themselves. But the church leaders always said, safety first, and really tried to emphasize that. But there's always church dynamics. And you see where some minimization, denial, and victim blaming occurred by church members, sometimes as well as by the pastors. Here, this woman remarked, the bulk of the church community supported me. Some didn't agree, especially the older ones. They said to me, you shouldn't have been with that guy and should have gotten married. A lot of people are understanding, knew what was going on, and shielded me from it and said to leave me alone. They said to those who were negative, you're doing the same thing to her he's been doing to her. Churches were good about providing housing, maybe food, transportation, care, and many different aspects, or maybe connecting them with resources. But there was definitely some denial and minimizing and blaming. Of the 3 participants who shared with their faith leader, 2 received a negative response. The pastor that demonstrated empathy had a wife who had experienced domestic violence in a prior relationship. One woman was told, due to her disability, she was a poor wife, didn't believe her husband could harm her despite physical evidence of harm. He said to her, your husband sits in the front row at church every Sunday. He's very calm, meek, mild-mannered. I cannot imagine him doing this. Even though she suffered contusions, her children did as well. So there was physical evidence of harm. He said the pastor said she was difficult to live with and needed to improve in her coping with her disability. He encouraged the 3 of them to meet together, which is an absolute, you never do that, right, in IPV care. And he sent shaming and victim-blaming messages to the survivor. So what happened? It escalated the abuse, which research has documented over and over again. And of course, now he has a powerful figure like a faith leader saying it's not his issue. Another survivor was told by her pastor, when are you going to learn you shouldn't be shacking up? This is the consequence for the sin of shacking up. Some of the supportive faith beliefs and practices that they used in the midst of this was some of these. God gave me many times to escape, but I didn't take it. When I realized I could escape, I did. So this really speaks to not being really person-centered in our care. You focus on the individual and when they want to move and when they feel it's safe, because leaving is the most unsafe time in the relationship. And when she was ready, she had the self-determination. That's when supporters around her need to be helping her in that direction, but letting her make those decisions. Reading Psalms came up a couple of different times, and then they said they wouldn't have gotten through it without a hope in our Lord Jesus Christ and Scripture. And then for that Christian domestic violence advocate who supported that aspect of healing. Here are some of the misuse of spiritual beliefs by perpetrators. He used the Bible and the church to dominate me because he knew I was raised in a church and my family is pastors. I was very confused. I never associated God with hurt, but now I did. He told me that women should be seen but not heard because the Apostle Paul told women to stop chattering in the church. Many other scriptures were taken out of context and used as a weapon. So those are some examples. What are the barriers that we see related to disabilities in particular? We've talked about shame, not wanting to tell, inequitable law, lack of awareness of what's abusive behavior, and that can take time to realize. But, and that, they also, these women did talk about, they were sad they couldn't bring in faith beliefs and scripture and all of those resources into their group meetings at the DVA, the Domestic Violence Agency. Sometimes they could do it on a one-on-one, it just depended on the domestic violence advocate. They were concerned about accessibility of transportation, lack of transportation and jobs, being in poverty. Some of the data really clearly shows that women who have disabilities, a good number work in the service sector. And in 2015, Brault looked at the data of how much money are they actually making compared to, say, a professional. It was like, per week was $461 to like $980. And double marginalization for having a disability and being a female. Typically, another study showed they make about 80% that men with disabilities make, and about 70% of men without disabilities. And a further study even went and looked at education, right? If they have an undergrad degree, do they have graduate work? That's still, there was a huge gap in employment. So that was a huge issue, the poverty, and do I leave this perpetrator, but then my children and I, or I myself, where will we go? This was really helpful. A domestic violence advocate made concrete plans and simplified language and color-coded it for those who had processing issues. If this happens, then do this. How do I get out of this situation quickly? Some of the clients struggled with attachment, flooding of emotion, a terrible alone feeling, and wanting to always be with other people, other friends, and just feeling huge abandonment. And so learning to go through many years of therapy and learn how to appropriately have appropriate boundaries around friendships and relationships. And then there was exclusion too of mental health disabilities. One client was told that she couldn't be a part of their outpatient treatment group because if she ever talked about any of her psychotic symptoms, then the leaders of the group would say it's a trigger for some of the other individuals in the group. And so they just said you can't come back after 2 times of being there. And so she found an online group, The Refuge, that was much more supportive for her particular mental health disability, which was interesting. These are unhelpful responses to the survivors. Telling the survivor to submit to the husband, pray enough, IPV will stop. Using these passages, biblical passages out of context, bully or deny or minimize the abuse. Display ableist attitudes and actions, try to fix them, tell them that they have to overcome their disability, pity them, or believe that having a disability is just inherently negative, blame the IPV on disability, pass judgment on the survivor, all kinds of things that can be very ignorant of what a disability is like, what it's like to have one. There was a pastor who made fun of the disability in front of this one client. So what is helpful? What can we do that actually provides most culturally competent care? Being person-centered, how can I help you? Listening carefully, and just providing empathy. Empower the survivor to make those decisions. If they don't know, provide an array of options that others have used. Let them make their own decisions. Meet separately with the survivor and perpetrator. Provide support groups by severity of abuse. I had even in those 7 clients, had a range of severity of abuse. And so that seemed to be a common theme from those women. Listen for layers and for the specifics of those situations. just because you have a disability, and a specific type of disability, doesn't mean that your needs are going to be the same as the next individual's, and having people be aware of that. Ask if they'd like to bring in a faith perspective, support to IPV services, even in group work. Allow the survivor to share about that faith perspective, especially as it pertains to separation and divorce and the roles of men and women. Help them find safe churches. Just ask what coping strategies and accommodations work best with their disability. Gain knowledge about the abuse and disability, but know your own limitations and be prepared with referrals. The literature really strongly suggests partnering with disability agencies for trainings. They're the experts in those areas. Faith leaders and domestic violence advocates should really be training with those agencies. Build the survivor's confidence and self-efficacy in using those disability coping strategies. One of my clients was like, I don't know what is, and her husband of course is blaming her and that's all her fault. She's like, I have 3 little kids. Where, is it that? Is it my disability? And what part is his? And so she's like, I'm trying to figure out how do I use better coping strategies, but how much of it is, it's really hard to care for 3 kids, 4 years of age and under, and just needing some more help with that. Taking time to listen, slow the pace of discussion, reduce the intensity of the emotions as the group leader, provide universal design to these programs, exhibit a calm demeanor to help someone who's working really hard to process. They said that the domestic violence shelter, even though it was well known, it was very inaccessible as far as there wasn't like a safe online application, accessible website. We really need to have people with disabilities checking out these websites and giving some helpful feedback. And then with low incidence disabilities such as blindness or deafness, we really need to think far out in advance. Those without disabilities aren't used to doing this, but we need to think far out in advance of getting all of that like digital copies so that they can read it ahead of time and so forth. So, and making sure, of course, as Andy mentioned, providing RID certified interpreters because the deaf community is very tight and small, and so we want to make sure we have highly trained interpreters talking about such important details in a domestic violence situation. All right. So yeah, this was not religiously very diverse, all Christian backgrounds and beliefs. It was a selected group by the domestic violence advocate, small sample size, but what's the next step? I'm really hoping that we can go more broadly and get more maybe of a national survey of faith leaders, of women who are experiencing IPV, who have a faith background. Where do they see the gaps? What has been helpful? What are the practices like? How accessible are faith leaders and their supportive responses, as well as the domestic violence advocates? One of the key things that we know already is isolation is such a contributing factor. How important it is to think of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model and start networking these women back into their families, back into their churches, but only if they're welcoming and accessible, or finding safe churches for them, really trying to network them in, whether it's in jobs or housing or whatever, trying to build in the support that they desperately need around them. So, all right. Any questions you guys have for us? Lots of information. Yeah.
Did you only contact 7 women, or is that the only amount that applied to
That's the only amount, yeah. So it was hard first to find someone who had a faith background and was currently practicing, and then someone who also had experienced IPV but was far enough out, so it was safe and they were in a good spot where they felt like they could sit down and talk with us. Yeah, so that was just the number. I kept praying for every individual to come forward. But that's where I think the accessibility piece, like just even coming and doing an interview, can be hard. So if it's online, there may be more accessibility in that way. What responses?
One thing to keep in mind is that the results of the study in question here are paralleled by other studies by Potter, Nadine Caslow's group, and Gillam's group, and Tricia Beck Goodley, and so on. So we're seeing similar findings, with the exception of the idea that the disability level adds a complicating factor. And that oftentimes people don't think ahead of time about what would it mean to include and incorporate people with disabilities in our congregation, what resources are out there that are available for people with disabilities. So for example, in the church I was at when we were writing the book, there were 2 men with disabilities there, and they had been kicked out of 2 churches prior for being too noisy. And they had both intellectual disabilities, and at the church where I was at, this Moravian church, they actually had both men were involved in packing sandwiches for a homeless shelter. One did all he could do, which arguably wasn't that much, but he did all he could do, which was more than I did. And the other was actually quite adept. And one would actually preach sermons every now and then. He was quite popular because he could keep it under 10 minutes. But they weren't welcome on the purpose. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Much.